This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, welcome to the Friday Circle. We have our usual monthly special guest speaker outside the community. Alhamdulillah, we can see what's happening in Gaza. All of us are aware. No need to actually go over it again. But the change you can see as well in terms of the reaction. It's 7 months and people haven't given up. They haven't resigned their efforts. If anything, the efforts to actually stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters has intensified in the UK and across the world. And we're seeing the reaction now. They don't know how to deal with it. We see the impact of direct action. We see the impact of people coming out in the streets every single week. So what we want to do today is find out what can we do beyond the protesting, beyond the boycotting. Every single one of us has the capability within us that we can actually deal with. So we all, especially the gift that Allah has given us, we have a state, we have something in our lives that we need to tap into and decide what is it that's going to make a change and how we're going to do it. So who we have with us today, inshallah, we have a special brother Kareem, also known as Lowkey. He's a British Iraqi hip-hop artist, academic and political campaigner. He's a patron of the Stop the War Coalition, the Racial Justice Network and the Peace and Justice Project, founded by Jeremy Corbyn. He has Masters in Middle Eastern Studies in SOAS, and is an advisor to the website Declassified, which investigates the activities of the Ministry of Defence and British Intelligence Services. He's very active on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, X. He has been, I don't know if we get to Palestine, but I know he's been detained on many occasions trying to get into Palestine by the Israelis and some exit interrogation. So he's someone that doesn't just talk the talk, he actually walks the walk as well. So without further ado, Brother Kareem is going to talk to us about what we can do, what we must do, and our role in standing with the people in Gaza at the moment.
Yeah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله ينصر شعبنا في فلسطين وينتقم من كل الظالمين. Now, to start with, I think the important point to establish and have clarity on is what exactly is the British role in what is happening today. Britain has a very well-oiled PR machine which is able to disguise its actual activities as noble intention incompetence at worst, shall we say. But in an actual material day-to-day sense, Britain has a nuts and bolts logistic role in this genocide in Gaza. There's a secret military agreement between Britain and Israel signed in 2020, which we cannot gain access to the details of. It is very likely to have specific implications if either of those parties enter war, as Israel considers itself to have officially done on October 8th. Now, what we do know is that since the Ibadah in Gaza has started, the genocide in Gaza has started, you have seen 9 different Israeli military jets land in this country. We do not know the content of those jets. We also know that near to 100 British R-1 Shadow plane spy missions have flown over the top of Gaza. Now, the R-1 Shadow plane, one of its specialities is target acquisition. It is therefore a reasonable question to ask if Britain has directly assisted in targeting in Gaza. We also know that there's been over 50 British military flights directly to Tel Aviv, which really is an exponential increase from the amount that previously were prior to October 7th. Most of those flights have gone from Akrotiri, the British base in Cyprus. What we also know is that the US has used that base to transport weapons to the Israelis, and the exact planes that Britain sent to Tel Aviv from that base would have been able to carry. They are set up to carry military hardware. What we also know is immediately after the war began, Britain sent 500 extra troops to Akrotiri. The question is, what were those troops sent for? In addition to that, I don't know if we are all aware of what a D-notice is. The British government issued a D-notice following October 7th. The D-notice is when the government sends a message directly to the media and asks them specifically not to talk about a particular subject. Now, a story had been published a few days before the D-notice was issued about SAS operations in quote-unquote hostage rescuing in Gaza. That means that it seems that if Britain would send a D-notice asking the media not to mention SAS activity in Gaza, that Britain has extended that. There would be no reason to require the media not to write about it if there wasn't more to the story. What you also have is the example of Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, asserting that from the bases in Cyprus, Britain is spying on the communications of the Palestinian resistance factions and feeding that information back to the Israelis. So what we're talking about here is a material way in which Britain is involved in the war. In addition to that, you have, for example, the F-35 fighter jet, which Israel has relied upon in its bombing of Gaza, having more than 100 UK-based companies actually involved in the construction of that plane. And actually, BAE Systems, which is the largest arms company in this country, had its highest ever profits in 2023, at least in part thanks to the war in Gaza. BAE raked in record sales of £25 billion in that 1 year. Now, just so we're clear, BAE Systems, it provides the Israeli Air Force with essential systems for the F-35, the F-16 and the F-35 fighter jets. For example, the F-16, the targeting within it functions off the basis of BAE Systems technology, the HUD gun sight technology. And in fact, in the case of the F-35, the main US company that works on it, Lockheed Martin, has stated that 15% of the value of the F-35 is made in Britain. The direct quote from Lockheed Martin is, "The fingerprints of British ingenuity can be found on dozens of the aircraft's key components." BAE Systems also has a history of working with Israeli arms companies like the Israeli government-owned Rafael and the infamous Elber Systems. You have the Rokar silver bullet system, which was developed by BAE Systems in direct cooperation with the Israeli military and then sold on to IMI Systems, which is a subsidiary of Elber Systems. Also, the protector drone that the Israeli military uses, it functions with a system called the Mk-38 Typhoon gun system, which BAE Systems was directly involved in upgrading through collaboration with Rafael, the company I mentioned before. Even Israel's Apache attack helicopters have components from BAE Systems and its former subsidiary, Rokar. You know, Britain ultimately is a signatory and a ratifier of the Arms Trade Treaty, meaning that it should not make any export which may, quote unquote, may be used for violations of international humanitarian law. Britain is consistently breaking its own laws on arms exports by continuing to arm Israel. Now, in the case of, I'm not sure if everyone saw the bombing of the World Central Kitchen convoy that took place in Gaza, where you saw, if I remember correctly, six aid workers killed. Now, 3 of those aid workers were actually British citizens, and they were simultaneous to their presence in Gaza being employed by the British intelligence firm Solis Global. So it therefore begs the question, is and one of them at least was former special forces, two of them were former British military, they've been in Afghanistan, they've been involved in the war on terror. Now, the question has to be asked, in the neoliberal era, whereby companies come in to fulfill the functions of the state, is it possible that you had individuals fulfilling these services for British special forces through a private company like Solace Global? But the great irony in all of this is that the Spike missile, which killed these aid workers, or at least ostensibly aid workers, was manufactured by the Israeli state-owned arms company Rafael. Now, Rafael has a factory in this country. That's an Israeli state-owned factory in Newcastle. And the head of this company that Rafael has, this subsidiary, Pearson's Engineering, is actually currently a sitting member of the House of Lords for the Labour Party by the name of John Hutton. Now, this is one aspect of Israel's role in this country. I think a lot has been done to disguise what exactly Israel is up to here. Now, an agreement was signed March 2023 by the British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and Eli Cohen, the Foreign Minister of the Zionist entity at the time. Now, what we know is that there are 400 Israeli tech companies that operate on British soil, and this agreement that took place between the British government and Israel saw Israel being elevated to a tier 1 cyber partner. So that entails deeper integration on an intelligence level, and I'll get into some of the ways in which Britain and Israel have been more deeply integrated than ever in history. Just so we have in perspective, it was found that the NSO group, one of Israel's most well-known spy companies, offshoot of Unit 8200, the signals intelligence unit within the Israeli military. The NSO group had its hardware, its Pegasus spyware, found on the phones of 400 citizens in this country, including one in the office of Downing Street at the time that Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. Now, in contrast to even the US context, where you saw the NSO group actually blacklisted, we have not seen the same thing happen in this country, despite how deeply that integration went. And when talking about Unit 8200, this is a very, very key part of Israel's ability to invisibilize the occupation in Palestine. And off the back of the Oslo Agreement, Unit 8200 was able to gain access to swaths of Palestinian telecommunications as never before. Because until Oslo, the vast majority actually of Palestinian society were not connected to landline phones. It was Oslo that beckoned in the connection and the rendering of their conversations more audible to Unit 8200. Now, the relationship between GCHQ in this country, Britain's largest intelligence agency, and Unit 8200 is so close that actually the GCHQ has designed a way to streamline its grooming, of young people in schools, through the school system, into spies by modeling it on the Unit 8200 Mag-Shamin program that they roll out in the schools in the Zionist entity. Now, there is a lot more to the ways in which Israel has a role in this country that it really should not have. And we're talking about the basic issue of, from an international relations realist perspective, what you would call sovereignty, when actually the very company that carries out the hacking of phones for the British security services goes by the name of Celebrite. Now, Celebrite is governed and run by alumni of Unit 8200 in the Israeli military. And one of the key ways in which this company, Celebrite, was able to procure that contract was through an organization by the name of the UK Israel Tech Hub. This is an organization based in the British Embassy, in the Zionist entity, which employs almost exclusively former Israeli military and intelligence personnel. And it's based inside the British Embassy. It's funded by the British Foreign Office. It's funded by the British Department of Trade. And it's funded by the British Embassy itself. Now, that organization exists to procure public sector contracts in this country for Israeli tech companies. I've never heard of an arrangement like that. Britain certainly has no type of arrangement like that with other countries. It has a UK-Nigeria tech hub, it has a UK-South Africa tech hub, but they do extremely different, like completely different things. Completely different things. So the UK-Israel tech hub has, based in the British Embassy, in the Zionist entity, former personnel from Israeli intelligence, and it's funded by the British government. There's far more aspects of this story that really require a lot more attention. So for instance, if you were to look at who handles the data of the British Ministry of Defence, of the Home Office, of the NHS, and of the Foreign Office, you'd find a company by the name of Oracle. Some of us may have even heard of this company in the room. It may be present in the company that we work for. But what is Oracle? And who is behind the company? Now, Oracle was founded as a way of servicing the CIA in the 70s by a gentleman called Larry Ellison, who is, according to some, the seventh richest person in the world, according to others, the fifth or fourth. But Larry Ellison, as well as heading Oracle, the company that handles the data in these most sensitive parts of the British state, also is the largest donor to the Friends of the IDF in the history of that organization. He is the largest donor to the Israeli military in the history of that organization. The relationship between Larry Ellison and Israel is so close that he offered the directorship of the company to Benjamin Netanyahu while he had the contract for these institutions in this country. And it's a massive, massive contract. What you also have to remember is that he funds settlements as well, Larry Ellison. We're talking about, under this contract, there is a £2 billion budget and a team of around 2,400 people processing this information coming out of these key institutions of state here. There's another part of the story about Larry Ellison and Oracle's procurement of this contract, which looks more closely at his activities in the run-up to the procuring of the contract. He had a charity which directly employed Boris Johnson's father-in-law. At the same time, he was bidding for a contract that Boris Johnson would have had some say over as Prime Minister. So really, we're in a situation where Israel is able to assert its agency in this country in many different, quite complex ways. And I think we have to apply an understanding of Islamophobia that looks at the role of Israel in this country in working to astroturf movements that seek to change legislation. You look at the development of the Prevent program, for example, and the Henry Jackson Society. This is an organization with very close relationships directly to the Israeli military. Several former high-ranking Israeli military personnel present in the Henry Jackson Society. Even moving on from that, you've had several individuals that have moved between Israeli military units and the Henry Jackson Society back and forth. Douglas Murray, formerly was the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, has just been given an award directly by the Israeli president. And in fact, the founder of the Henry Jackson Society, Alan Mendoza, simultaneous to founding and running the Henry Jackson Society, is a key figure at the JNF, which is the largest settlement building body in occupied Palestine. So for the Henry Jackson Society to militate tirelessly and relentlessly against the Muslim community in this country, seek to change legislation, but it not to be pointed out that the Henry Jackson Society and Israel are very close to each other. And in fact, the JNF is one of Israel's 4 national institutions. And for the founder of the Henry Jackson Society to be a key figure there has to be serious question marks asked, serious question marks about it. But then the other question is, what is the rollout against the outpouring of support for the Palestinians in this country due to be, and what is happening within key institutions like schools? Well, you have several operations targeted directly at children with the intention of normalizing Zionism as an idea. One of those organizations goes by the name of Solutions, Not Sides. Now, I've investigated the organization at length, and I have found that among Solutions Not Sides and One Voice, which is its parent organization, there were 28 individuals who formerly were part of Israeli military and intelligence, and there were 3 individuals that were simultaneously employed by this organization and by the Israeli government at the same time. One of them, even as far as being the social media manager for the Israeli military, at the same time as working for this organization, which has free access in British schools and free access to our children. And Solutions Not Sides is not shy about what its intentions are. It says we are a program aimed at behavior moderation. It is aimed at effecting a change in the way that the younger generations look at what is happening in Palestine. You also have a group targeted at Muslim women, Nisa Nashim. Now, this organization was incubated. Those are the words used by the Board of Deputies, not me. It was incubated by the Board of Deputies. Now, the Board of Deputies, in its trustees' report, said that it has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy, that it has strengthened links with the IDF spokesman's department and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs at the time that it existed. Now, what is an organization like Nisa Nashim that has been incubated by an Israeli embassy proxy doing coming into masajid? What's it doing coming into masajid? Critical thinking about these organizations needs to be applied. It cannot just be a case of accepting the mabda, which is, no one sees a problem with the basic premise of interfaith engagement. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that the organizations themselves are acting in concert and with a Zionist agenda in order to achieve specific objectives in this country, specifically with the target population. The other question then is, when you look at he's now really been disavowed by particular parts of the Israel lobby, Tommy Robinson, but there has to be real interrogation of who is Tommy Robinson, how did he develop, and where was he getting paid? So, for example, when Tommy Robinson was at the height of his mischief making in this country, he was a Shillman Fellow at something called the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Now, being a Shillman Fellow meant that he was paid £10,000 a month by the tech billionaire Robert Shillman. Who was Robert Shillman? He was simultaneously on the board of directors of the Friends of the IDF. It is therefore that I am completely comfortable saying that Tommy Robinson was an Israeli military asset. While he was describing Muslims in this country as combatants, and that's not a statement which is made in a flippant way. He's not whimsically referring to Muslims as combatants. He's calling them combatants because it legitimizes the killing of them. So what he's essentially trying to build was an atmosphere of pogroms and attacks against Muslims on the streets. At the same time, his wage was being paid by a director of the Friends of the IDF. And there's more to it in his connections with the Israel lobby. When you break down where the funding for him has come from over the years from several different organizations, many of them have been invested in the building of illegal settlements in the West Bank, and many of them have also been funders of the Israeli military directly. In fact, a quite a useful book, I think, with some of this. Brother Asim was one of the contributors to it. Islamophobia, social movements from above, the 5 pillars of Islamophobia. What they identify in the chapter by Sarah Marusek is that 75% of the organizations that are involved in the pushing of Islamophobia within society, 75% of them are also funded by, so 75 of the organizations that fund the Islamophobia network also fund the building of illegal settlements in Palestine. So that's not incidental. There is a direct correlation between those who are pushing the wider project of Zionism and Zionist fascism in Palestine and those who are pushing Islamophobia in the Western world, particularly in this country. Now, what are some of the effective ways in which people have been able to push back against what seems like a flawless path of power really within our society? So one of the examples has been the movement of Palestine Action. Now, Palestine Action developed out of an intransigence within the elite of this country, an impossibility to change the policy. And what did Palestine Action do? They said, okay, well, as far as we understand, according to your laws, you should not be arming the Israelis in what they are doing. But we've identified these factories which operate on this soil and which are selling weapons and exporting them to Israel. When we apply pressure to some of these factories, what we've seen is they are almost like pressure points, and like a domino effect, they have been falling. So since the founding of Palestine Action in 2019, you have seen in 2020 that this figure for investors that have pulled out of Elber Systems actually comes from 2019. So we can say around 70 to 77 investors have pulled out of Israel's largest arms company, Elber Systems. In the UK context, you've seen 20% fall from the value of the shares of Elber Systems UK, partly thanks to the activity of Palestine Action. But importantly, this movement, which believes in going directly into the factories and shutting them down, has seen Elbit Systems forced to sell 2 subsidiaries in this country at a loss. The first of them was Ferranti Technologies in Oldham, which, thanks to the activity of Palestine Action in tandem with the local community, saw Ferranti Technologies, which was procured by Elbit Systems for around £12 million, sold for £9 million. What you've also seen is the selling of Elite KL in Tamworth. This was a company that made cooling units for Israeli tanks, go on to not only Elite KL vacate that building after it was sold by Elbit Systems, but then for the technology in that factory to be used to make similar contraptions for public transport. In addition to that, Elbit Systems headquarters, its main office in London, was shut down and vacated permanently thanks to Palestine Action. In addition to that, its UK recruiter, IO Associates, dumped Elbit Systems. Its website designer dumped Elbit Systems. And its contract was cancelled with the property manager, Fisher German, and also the logistics company which transports its hardware. Now, in the case of how we stand to affect government policy through the activity of Palestine Action, you saw the British Ministry of Defence cancel £280 million worth of contracts with Elbit Systems. And why did they cancel those contracts? The exact words used by Alexander Chalk, the Minister for Defence Procurement, was that these contracts are problematic for operational sovereignty. Problematic for operational sovereignty. And why? Because when Palestine Action would get into some of these factories, like the case being in Bristol, some of the hardware would end up on camera on the internet. So if you are the Ministry of Defense, you would look at a company like Elber Systems and you say it's far too exposed. We don't need the materials that we may later need exposed on camera for the world to see on the internet. So it has been transformed to a toxic brand. And we have not seen victories like the victories of Palestine Action in the history of activity supporting Palestine in this country. We have not, there is no equivalent. There is no equivalent to what has been achieved in a very short period of time. But what is Israel planning to do next, and why should we be concerned? Well, Gaza, in the project for Greater Israel, is a stepping stone. The depopulation of Gaza, as impossible as it seems, is being pursued by the Zionist movement for what they see as the greater good, and producing a kind of society which they have aimed for since the beginning of the Zionist movement. And I think one of the harshest realizations for many of us who feel emotionally invested in the Palestinian cause is that the Nakba and the 75 years following it was a precursor to this now. It was a precursor to what is happening now. But in order for Zionism as an idea to exist within the region it exists, there has to be at least 3 more fairly major wars, maybe one of them slightly less major. But one of those wars is going to, and there's a reason why the spark for what we're talking about this period, the name Tawfan al-Aqsa, will explain to you what this was for. This was about Al-Aqsa. But what is happening at Al-Aqsa? We are constantly being given images of settlers coming in, and it says another settler raid in Al-Aqsa. And this is something that everybody looks at and shakes their head. But in actuality, this is a part of a movement. And that movement is the Temple Mount movement. A key part of the Zionist project is what they see as the restoring of the Temple Mount. Solomon's Temple, as they call it. They believe to have existed twice in human history. And it's not a part of the Zionist movement which is fringe now. Post-67, it was fringe to some extent. You had individuals from the Temple Mount movement clash directly with the Israeli military several times. But now it has been fully integrated into the mechanisms of that state to such an extent that the main organization pursuing these aims, the Temple Institute, is funded not only by the Israeli Ministry of Culture, but also the Ministry of Education. Now, this organization believes in the necessity of completely clearing the space of the Al-Aqsa compound and the replacement of Al-Aqsa. That's the aim. That's the aim. And that's not according to me. That's according to an Israeli army investigation from 2013. Not only is it funded by the Israeli Ministry of Culture and the Israeli Ministry of Education, it's also been funded by a sitting deputy defense minister of the state. But then also in addition to that, it is funded by an individual by the name of Simon Falek, who the founder of Duty Free America. But just so you understand how close Simon Falek is to the Israeli political elite, when Benjamin Netanyahu stayed elsewhere outside his home on the recent weekend when Iranian missiles struck the Zionist entity, he stayed at the house of Simon Falek. And Simon Falek has a bunker underground So this is a movement that is fully supported by the Israeli political elite, less so by the military elite, but supported by key institutions of government. And so much so that conscription, as it exists within Zionist society, it is offered by the Israeli military for women who would prefer not to fight in the Israeli military to become part of the Temple Institute. That's the level of integration between this movement, and that is how much it is an assertion of the Zionist endeavor in Palestine. Now, what is the situation of states around the world, and what is likely to be their response, not only to Gaza, but to what is being pursued by Israel vis-a-vis Al-Aqsa? Well, there's been quite a seismic shift in the past 24 hours in terms of Turkey. And this is very interesting, and I'm quite hopeful about it. Now, previously there'd been reports that Turkey was cutting trade, but there had been nothing materializing. However, yesterday a statement was made by the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz, in which he was furious with Turkey on this, and he said, we are looking for trade everywhere else that we can, not from Turkey. So just so we get an idea of what's happened, Turkey has cut trade with Israel. We don't know how comprehensive it is, but we do know that ships have been turning around in the middle of the water and heading back to occupied Palestine, heading back to Turkey. They've turned away from ports in the last 24 hours. Now, in 2022 alone, there was $10 billion worth of trade between Turkey and Israel. If this does happen, then you're going to see what is already a staggering economy. Israel is in a state of economic paralysis. You've seen over 100,000 reservists taken out of the traditional economy. You have seen over 100,000 people driven from the north and unable to return to their homes because of the open front with South Lebanon. So there's many ways in which the Israeli economy is suffering, and a move like this from Turkey would certainly be very, very interesting, to say the least. But what about the rest of the countries that we may look to support the Palestinian cause? So it was recently revealed that even a country like Indonesia, which is a mighty civilization, a massive population, and a significant player, that actually it has been outsourcing several aspects of its security state functions to four Israeli intelligence companies: the NSO group, like we mentioned before, Kandiro, Wintigo, and Intelexa. All of those Israeli companies have received big contracts from the Indonesian state since 2018 to carry out some form of surveillance on its population. What about the UAE? Well, the UAE has signed a deal to allow Celebrite, the very company that hacks phones in this country for the British security services, to hack phones in the UAE, in a deal which was negotiated by the former head of Mossad. What about Pakistan, for example? Even the Pakistani intelligence services use Celebrite, this Israeli intelligence company. They purchased this technology via Singapore. So we are seeing Singapore sometimes act as a third state to handle some of these transactions. What about Saudi? Well, unfortunately, and this is just a fact. This is just a fact. Both Celebrite and the NSO group have been used by the Saudi government to hack phones of their own citizens. What that denotes, and it's important that we understand what these relationships denote, they denote a certain level of integration between those agencies, between those key agencies where sovereignty is the most important thing. And moreover, both the NSO group and both Celebrite claim to have access to the information which is gained on those systems. But what you've also seen is the development of other groups, whether it's in Yemen or yesterday in Bahrain, for example, targeting sites within occupied Palestine and targeting Israeli ships and interests in the region. So, to wrap up, we are
You carry on.
we are in a situation where, even, for example, if you look at BRICS, the economic grouping really of the future, the majority of the countries represented in BRICS vis-a-vis Palestine have a far more interesting and positive policy than the United States, for example. So Brazil, a key member, it's accused Israel of genocide. You also have to remember, when the missiles struck the two key bases in Israel that were fired from Iran, they were flown using satellite guiding systems from China and Russia. They could not have happened without a green light from those two states. They could not have happened without a green light from those two states. How has that come to be? How has a situation like that happened when Israel has historically had very cordial and good relationships with both of those states? In fact, a deeply integrated relationship with Russia. In fact, Celebrite was used by the Russian intelligence services until the operation in Ukraine. But how has this happened? Well, following October 7th, what you had was Ali Baraka from the political office of Hamas come out and say that the Russians had provided them with the licenses to produce bullets for the Kalashnikov locally. And this greatly offended the Israelis. But of course, the Israelis had been arming the Azov battalion in Ukraine with similar small arms. So what developed was a situation where Israel would no longer inform Russia before it would strike Syria. So then what happens in turn is Russia gives a green light to an operation that hits Israeli bases. So there's a deterioration of relations here, which is interesting. Not necessarily decisive, certainly not. We're not near a situation where it's decisive, but it's certainly an interesting development. In the Chinese context, also what you have is, well, actually, before we get to China, we look at one of the new additions to the BRICS, which is Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia has historically been the strongest ally of Israel on the African continent. We know that Ethiopia gave the Israeli Navy the right to use 2 islands in the Red Sea, and actually gave the Israeli Navy access to Bab el-Mandeb Straits. Israel was even able to form a commercial cover for its intelligence operations in Africa called Encoda, an Ethiopian company, which ostensibly was a shipping company, but it was acting to ship Israeli intelligence agents across the region. And you also have the assertion that Haile Selassie, when he was in power in Ethiopia, was actually saved from several different coups by Israeli intelligence and advisors that were based with him there. So the future is not clear in terms of what we can expect from a grouping like BRICS. But certainly the balance of power in the world is changing. The vast majority of humanity view themselves as post-colonial subjects, where decolonization was a positive force in their societies. So when they look at the Palestinian equation, they certainly do not see themselves in the Israelis, they see themselves in the Palestinians. And so we are on the verge of major shifts globally. What kind of role will we play? What kind of ability do we have and agency do we have within this country? I guess it's an open question, and I'm looking forward to hear more of what you all see as the ways in which we can be effective. But we do have a few examples of where pressure has been applied to particular pressure points of the Zionist project, and those points have responded almost like an open door. And I think it's worth looking at those examples, studying those examples, and finding ways that we can do this thing. We cannot get lost in a sentimentalism. We cannot get lost in simply emotionally feeling all of this and not acting. It's past that. It's past that. We must act now. We have a duty to.
Gonna move back. Jazakallah Brother Kareem. Before I open the floor, I think what would be really helpful is some of the, you said about there's certain options and pressure points to explore. And you sort of touched on PAL Action as one of those incredible projects that's happening. Could you sort of give some more detail about some of the other sort of direct action that people can get involved with, whether it's the campus protests or the occupation?
I think the campus protest is important, but I also think being able to organise students and parents in secondary schools against projects like Friends of Roots, Solutions Not Sides, Forum for Discussion of Israel-Palestine. I'm not saying this lightly. Those are projects that have the aim of normalising Zionism in school, and they want their children to come out of those schools speaking like Mahmoud Abbas. They want them to come out of those schools, say Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. This is another key way in which the British are deeply involved in what's happening in Palestine. They are responsible for the training and the arming of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is on a daily basis arresting and killing those who are practicing their right to resistance in the West Bank. And, you know, Mahmoud Abbas appeared in Riyadh a few days ago, and he said very clearly that it is our duty to provide Israel complete security. You know, that is a direct contradiction with the will of the vast majority of the population. You know, he's gone on record as saying التنسيق الأمني خط أحمر ومقدس. He said the security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel is a red line and is sacred. These were his exact words. This is what they want children to be imbued with within their secondary school education in this country. They want them to come out of the school saying, oh, there's no other choice but a two-state solution. Forget about the right of return. Forget about the Nakba and forget about the genocide. We need to empower and work with our children and our young people to be able to stand up very clearly against this and refuse it. And it has been successful. In Redbridge, for example, in Manchester, for example, I forget the name of the school, there was examples where parents and students were able to organize petitions and put those 300, 400 signatures on the desk of the school administrators and say, we reject the presence of this pro-Israel organization in classrooms with the children. And they're literally Israeli military personnel. Not so much in the case of Forum of Discussion of Israel-Palestine. In the case of Friends of Roots, they're actual settlers. Friends of Roots is even more further to that side than Solutions Not Sides. Solutions Not Sides will bring in former Israeli military personnel that have killed people in Gaza to talk to children. Friends of Roots will bring in actual illegal settlers according to Britain's understanding of what's happening in Palestine, and they'll bring them into classrooms. That's what's happening. And that's being paid for by the British government. So, you know, if we can push that off in the schools, then that, I think, is a very, very good start.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned about the Solutions Not Sides, because a few years ago, Gavin Williamson, when he was the Education Secretary, he issued a dicta, a letter to the school head teacher saying that any organization that rejects Israel's right to exist should not be allowed to come into the school or not be invited to schools to talk about Israel-Palestine. And he recommended 3 organizations which should. One was FODIP, one was Solutions Not Sides. I don't think Roots was... CST was the third one. So again, 3 very prominent Zionist groups. And these are recommendations. And since that time, these groups have been coming into schools across the country. So this is a serious problem that we have to actually gather together. Unfortunately, even in Muslim schools, we're seeing Muslim schools opening up the doors to these organizations, and when they have plenty of other options to come in and talk about what's happening in Palestine. So again, it's something that we can't take on board.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي